Joseph Stalin built an impenetrable forest fortress guarded by 300 soldiers and anti-aircraft batteries to ensure no one could kill him. But that exact security ultimately sealed his fate. Every night, Stalin stayed up for 16 hours, meticulously checking off thousands of names on execution lists. He purged everyone close to him, executing his top generals, his secret police chief, and even his own family, leaving him physically isolated at the absolute center of a highly fortified compound. Here, he instituted one final, fatal rule: an absolute ban on anyone crossing the threshold of his private quarters without his explicit permission. Then, on March 1st, 1953, the dictator suffered a massive stroke, alone in his office, collapsing entirely helpless to the floor. For an entire day, heavily armed guards stood just outside his door, but they were so paralyzed by the fear of execution that not a single one dared check on him. The absolute terror Stalin weaponized to control millions of people ultimately became the exact mechanism that prevented his own guards from saving his life.
Prisoners of their own fear. It's actually incredible to examine how achieving total dominance over millions of people paradoxically turned these men into terrified fugitives within their own borders.
When you look at their shared clinical profiles, a really dark pattern starts to emerge. I mean, think about it. From Stalin's alcoholic, abusive father to Gaddafi's destitute desert youth where he was sleeping outside and surviving on dates, to Amin's mother practicing witchcraft after his father abandoned them, these violent, unstable childhoods absolutely laid the groundwork. It bred severe antisocial behavior. These were guys who never had limits imposed on them, which led to this endless transgression of boundaries. And because of that, they were deeply, deeply suspicious of everyone, especially the people in their own inner circles.
Let's move into our first specific day. Section 2. Stalin, November 24th, 1938. The Great Purge nears its end. We're starting with a 60-year-old Joseph Stalin, sitting at the absolute peak of his totalitarian power, ruling an empire that spanned 1/6 of the globe and 11 time zones. To really wrap your head around his paranoia during the Great Purge, you have to look at the sheer, devastating scale of it. Over just a year and a half, he ordered the execution of 800,000 Russians. I mean, just do the math on that for a second. That averages out to 1,500 victims per day. That is literally one death every 57 seconds, functioning as this massive, scientifically structured system of elimination.
And his own words brilliantly illustrate this cold, calculating methodology. After the tragic suicide of his second wife, Nadia, Stalin seemingly just lost all human empathy. The mass extermination of real and imagined enemies? It wasn't some act of fiery rage. For him, it was a meticulous, 16-hour-a-day administrative task that he just managed right from his desk.
Following the ticking clock of November 24th, 1938, we get to see exactly how a day in his life unfolded. Stalin wakes up at 7 a.m. and gets straight to verifying a list that sentenced 3,178 people to death or deportation. By 1 p.m., he completely ignores his own sister-in-law Evgenia's desperate plea to free a family member from the freezing Siberian gulags. Then, at 6 p.m., he cynically scapegoats his loyal, bloodthirsty police chief, Nikolai Yezhov, the exact guy who had personally overseen 770,000 executions for him. Having neatly tied up those loose ends, Stalin spends midnight peacefully listening to Mozart on his sofa.
The contrast between that public persona and his private reality is just jarring. To the world, he was the omnipotent man of steel. But in reality, he was a frail, sickly guy suffering from psoriasis and throat infections. He lived like a lone wolf in an empty, heavily fortified dacha, protected by anti-aircraft batteries and 300 soldiers. The only person this so-called god truly trusted was his illiterate housekeeper and secret lover, Valentina.
Okay, part 3. Amin on March 26, 1974. The Enemy Within. We're shifting over to Uganda to see how this paranoia builds in a totally different context, examining Idi Amin 3 years into his brutal reign. This was a man who literally, personally tortured victims with sledgehammers in a chamber connected to his house by a secret tunnel, which led to an estimated 150,000 massacres in just his first few years.
Love them, but don't trust them. That chilling advice perfectly encapsulates Amin's descent into madness. Despite being this towering 1.95-meter, 125-kilogram former boxing champion, Amin was profoundly terrified. He'd spend his nights staring out from his balcony, just paralyzed by fear of the bushes outside his statehouse. And the crazy thing is, his paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. He correctly suspected that the assassins most likely to get to him would come from his very own inner circle.
Tracking the tension of this specific day, Amin woke up from a terrible nightmare about his own soldiers assassinating him. Completely unhinged by this, at 12:30 p.m., he furiously divorces his 3 wives on live national radio just because they had been partying with bodyguards. Later that afternoon, he confronts his educated cousin, General Charles Aroub, and pretends to reconcile with him. But of course, it was a trap. By midnight, Amin deployed his 18,000-man private death squad for an ambush that crushed Aroub's coup and left his cousin dead.
Now, being deeply influenced by his mother's witchcraft, Amin concluded this highly decisive day by visiting the Kampala morgue. There, he actually partook in a macabre Kakwa blood ritual, stabbing Aroubi's corpse just to taste his blood. His irrational paranoia had convinced him that tasting the blood was the only possible way to prevent his cousin's ghost from coming back for supernatural revenge.
Right, moving on to Section 4. Gaddafi, June 28, 1996, the spark of revolution. Here we're exploring Libya, focusing on a 54-year-old Muammar Gaddafi, a dictator completely and totally dominated by impulses, cocaine, alcohol, and extreme megalomania.
He constantly broadcasted himself as the fearless Arab Kennedy, right? Setting these wild global fashion trends and loudly defying Western imperialism. But his private reality was so incredibly stark. Gaddafi lived as a terrified fugitive inside a heavily guarded 6-square-kilometer compound. Vain and aging, he even forced Brazilian surgeons to perform plastic surgery on him in an underground bunker without general anesthesia because he was absolutely terrified of being vulnerable while asleep.
And look at this staggering sum, $144 billion. That represents the estimated personal wealth he hoarded. It's just a massive contradiction. He expertly manipulated his humble Bedouin roots for propaganda so he'd seem like a man of the people, all while blatantly plundering Libya's colossal oil and gas revenues from himself and his family.
Looking at the timeline of his crumbling facade, on June 28th, Gaddafi spent his morning receiving cosmetic treatments from his captive 400-woman Amazonian bodyguard harem. But at midnight, his intelligence chief warned him that over 1,000 desperate prisoners had rioted at the Abu Salim prison, using sledgehammers to literally break down the doors. Initially brushing off the severity, Gaddafi ultimately ordered a brutal, terrifying solution at 8:30 a.m. the next morning. A massive rooftop massacre of 1,270 trapped inmates, an execution that took hours to complete.
Which brings us to Section 5, the inevitable downfall, reaping the whirlwind. Let's analyze how the extreme paranoia and the horrific atrocities committed on these 3 days of crumbling regimes really sealed their historical fates. The walls they built to keep their enemies out ended up trapping them inside.
And their ultimate fates are just a pathetic reflection of their reigns. Stalin's intense isolation meant that when he suffered a stroke in 1953, his entourage was quite literally too terrified to disturb him. So he lay dying on his office floor for hours and suffered for 5 days completely alone. Amin was forced to flee the invading Tanzanian army, dying in exile in Saudi Arabia, nostalgic but unpunished. And Gaddafi, that Abu Salim massacre we literally just talked about, that is exactly what directly inspired the 2011 Arab Spring protests in Libya. The widows and mothers of those victims demanded the truth, sparking the revolution that ended with him being dragged from a sewage pipe and killed by the very citizens he had brutalized.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought regarding the dark psychology of supreme control. Based on the history we've just explored, does the pursuit of absolute power guarantee that the very mechanisms of terror used to maintain control are destined to trigger a regime's ultimate violent collapse? It is a heavy question, for sure, but one that history repeatedly demands